In theory, the draft process is fair. It's a fair process that allows the worst teams with the best picks of the draft and the previous contenders and Super Bowl champions with the final picks of each round. Simply put, it's a principle that is meant to promote parity among teams in the league. Yet in practice, for the most part, the terrible teams remain terrible and the juggernauts of the league remain dominant with a few ebbs and flows over time. However, the 2011 draft was much different. It gave conference bottom feeders a chance to contend and build a new foundation for their own franchise, while also giving contenders the opportunity to restock with athletes that allowed them to take the next step towards being world champions. But not every team was able to reap the benefits that the draft had to offer. So with that being said, I'm back again to recount the good, the bad, and the ugly that came thanks to the 2011 draft.
With the sixth pick in the 2011 NFL Draft, the Atlanta Falcons select Julio Jones, wide receiver, Alabama.
Julio Jones is a freak of nature. He's a 6'3", 220, 7-time Pro Bowl, 2-time All-Pro, freak of nature. And unless you've been living under a rock, you would know he's been a top 3 receiver for the better part of the decade. The Falcons moved up 20 spots to snag Jones with the 6th pick, cashed out, and did so while putting the Browns in the dirt. Atlanta gave up 5 draft picks to the Browns in order to make this move possible, and in typical Cleveland fashion, the picks never amounted to anything. Those picks would later go on to become Greg Little, Phil Taylor, and Owen Maritich in 2011, and Brandon Weeden in 2012. On the other side of the trade, Julio would have an immediate impact, eclipsing 1,000 yards and catching 10 touchdowns in just his second season on a roster that included Roddy White and Tony Gonzalez. However, he didn't truly break out until the 2014 season, where he began a 3-year stretch of elite production. In that 3-year span, Julio averaged 108 receiving yards a game, 15 yards per reception, and totaled 4,873 receiving yards, along with 323 catches. For context, Jones' stat line in this 3-year stretch alone is comparable to the careers of players like Torrey Smith and Amari Cooper. And while he has never been able to reach the level of play he sustained in that 3-year span, he has still produced dominant numbers in his last 3 seasons. Did I also mention that he's top 40 all-time in both receptions and receiving yards? Like I said earlier, Julio is a freak of nature, and if his physical attributes don't already give you that indication, his numbers and play in the field likely will.
Oh, let's go! What time is it? Game time! Game time! Game time! Game time! Let's go!
As it turns out, the other Dirty Birds of the AFC also made a bit of a splash in the 2011 draft. The Ravens made 8 selections, and 3 of them managed to carve out decent careers. Jimmy Smith and Tyrod Taylor would both be late bloomers, while Torrey Smith, being the outlier, made an immediate impact throughout Baltimore's 2012 championship run with over 100 targets and 800 yards in just his second season of play. Over the course of his career, he totaled over 3,000 receiving yards and 30 touchdowns. Jimmy Smith, Baltimore's first-round selection, also made a huge impact in the Super Bowl with his game-clinching defensive effort on Crabtree in 2013. But Jimmy didn't earn a respected role as a Raven until 2014, when he was considered the team's best defensive back. Since 2019, Jimmy has taken a backseat role and serves as veteran support on a fairly stacked secondary that includes Earl Thomas, Marlon Humphrey, and Marcus Peters. The Ravens' second substantial offensive pick became Virginia Tech QB Tyrod Taylor in the 6th round. Aside from being the guy you probably subbed out for Joe Flacco and Madden when you were playing with the Ravens because he was a speed demon, Taylor showed good potential as a signal caller and shared parallels with fellow Virginia Tech alum and mobile QB Mike Vick. The two grew up in the same area of Virginia and have maintained a great relationship since Taylor's successful career at Virginia Tech. And of course, with these similarities, football fans and journalists alike, in search of a narrative that doesn't exist, placed unreasonable expectations on the young QB. While Taylor was nowhere near as impactful or skillful as Vick, he did develop into a decent starting QB after leaving Baltimore. In 2015, the former Hokie finally got a chance to start with the Bills. He had become a Pro Bowler by the end of his first season with 20 touchdowns and 3,000 yards. In total, he amassed 51 touchdowns to 16 interceptions in his 3 years with the Bills. Taylor had a 22-20 record as a starter in Buffalo and never quite outlived the shadow of Michael Vick due to terrible management and coaching. But he did create his own identity as Tyrod Taylor. After wasting a year in Cleveland, Taylor is now 30 and reunited with Anthony Lynn on the LA Chargers. Tyrod has reclaimed his role as the starting quarterback in the league and is looking to mitigate years of damage to the Chargers left behind by Dean Spanos himself. Hopefully.
You know, you do need a nickname to be seen as great. You need a handle, you know, and I know you guys had a DB nickname, No Fly Zone, right? I don't know if that even stuck, right?
Yeah, it was just something that we were just saying, you know, kind of just caught on. You know, we were kind of balling, making a lot of plays, and kind of that's kind of what people start to say is No Fly Zone.
I like that.
Yeah, you don't get.
Taking Von Miller with the second pick in the 2011 draft was the very beginning of a long process that eventually culminated into a 2015 God Squad on the defensive side of the ball. It was fitting that Von Miller went head-to-head against Cam Newton in Super Bowl 50 to decide the true number one of the 2011 draft. And it was even more fitting that Von Miller left with a victory and the Super Bowl MVP. There was no going wrong with either of the top two prospects of Miller and Newton. But when it comes to their roles in the league, there's definitely something to be said about the importance of individual achievements and records versus real hardware that can immortalize a player's place in NFL history. When it comes to ranking NFL players, Miller has fortified himself as one of the best pass rushers in the league with 106 career sacks and 490 tackles in 135 games. And barring his injury-shortened 2013 season and his most recent season, Miller has had double-digit sacks for every season of his career. But unlike Newton, Miller refuses to let the over-the-hill discussions hit his feed. The Broncos also went on to draft two-time Pro Bowl tight end Julius Thomas and tight end Virgil Green with their 4th and 7th round picks. And they would also acquire an absolute gem in undrafted free agency in Chris Harris, who has been the team's top corner for a better part of the entire decade. Harris has earned Pro Bowl honors 4 times and All-Pro honors once in his career, and his tenure with the Broncos has since ended after the 2019 season due to the persistent struggles the team has continued to face. He instinctively signed with the division rival in the Chargers, who, while having a considerably talented defensive roster, still have many questions regarding their own future. When you really step back, Denver had one of the most underrated drafts among every other franchise. They secured one of the best pass rushers in this era of football, while also setting the foundation for the no-fly zone and a brand new winning culture that the Broncos had lacked since the 90s. While this culture didn't last long, it was interesting to see John Elway put together one of the best defenses in NFL history by pulling as many strings as he could.
I mean, you got a lot of legendary quarterback. Boomer Esiason played over there. Carson Palmer played over there. But all I remember is the Cincinnati Bengals team being able to rattle off wins when Andy Dalton was playing. They had like 9 wins, 10 wins, 11 wins, but they could just never get there.
Last episode, I focused on the shortcomings in players and their failure to properly develop. But this time around, I'm looking to focus on the shortcomings of teams and their inability to manage and develop quality talent. And since the term mismanagement and Cincinnati Bengal are generally interchangeable, I believe that's a good place to start. The 2010 season marked the end of the Carson Palmer and Chad Ochocinco era, and the 2011 draft was the beginning of the Andy Dalton and AJ Green QB receiver combo. Green and Dalton were taken with the Bengals' 1st and 2nd round picks and had an immediate impact on the field while fostering a strong off-the-field friendship. Not only did the latter duo rack up more wins, Pro Bowls, and better overall numbers, they might be one of the most overlooked scoring duos in NFL history. Green and Dalton have connected for 58 touchdowns total. For context, duos like Jerry Rice and Joe Montana and Antonio Gates and Phillip Rivers had just over 60 connections before breaking up. So if Green and Dalton were so good, what did the Bengals do? In their 8 years together, they did tally 71 wins and had 4 consecutive 10-win seasons, but they never won a single playoff game. In fact, throughout Marvin Lewis's entire 16-year tenure as coach, the Bengals never won in the playoffs despite appearing 7 times. The talent of Andy and AJ was severely mishandled in Cincinnati, along with a handful of other players on the Bengals with great potential. And while it's unfortunate to see the Bengals unceremoniously end Andy Dalton's career in Cincy, he did have to escape purgatory somehow.
Philadelphia! If you love the Eagles, let me get a hell yeah! You love the Philadelphia Eagles, let me get a hell yeah!
It's 2011. The Eagles just got off a very solid first season with Mike Vick under center and are the reigning champs of the NFC East. The draft has passed and the Eagles now have an 11-man draft class that is almost as large as the 13-man draft class the year before, and are looking to complement the already established trio of Deshaun Jackson, LaShawn McCoy, and Mike Vick. Obviously, it didn't work out this way, and the Eagles had one of the more disastrous drafts considering their large number of selections. Of course, Jason Kelce ended up being one of the best centers in the league after being selected in the 6th round, and Deion Lewis in the 5th round, who was intended to have a career as a return specialist, but had a substantial career in both New England and Tennessee as a true running back. But these were just 2 guys in a stacked draft class in which the Eagles had 11 selections. The other 9 had careers that did not last beyond 4 years. The terrible production that came from this draft played a large part in Andy Reid's undoing and firing in 2012, and the torture chamber that they would later face thanks to Chip Kelly in 2013. The Eagles were able to turn it around with a tremendous draft the following year and draft Michael Kendricks, Nick Foles, Vinnie Curry, and Fletcher Cox, all of whom would later become solid starters and big contributors in the franchise's first Super Bowl.
3rd and 10. Here comes Jared Allen, and he's out of bounds. Poor guy, I don't even know if he realized it.
The Detroit Lions have struggled to put together a reasonable roster for some time, so it shouldn't come to a surprise to you if I told you they probably had the worst draft class in 2011. Detroit only made 5 total selections, and their top 2 talents were Nick Fairley and Titus Young, who both ended up being troubled individuals. Fairley had his fair share of run-ins with the law and was severely underwhelming as a top 3 defensive line prospect, but Titus ended up being more than troubled. During his first season, Young was reported to have a personality change that resulted in damaging on and off the field misbehavior. His altercations with teammates and opponents eventually escalated to real criminal offenses off the field following his brief 2-year career. Since being diagnosed with bipolar disorder in 2013, Young was sentenced to 4 years in prison in 2017 following an arrest on charges of assault, released in 2018, and is now speculated to have CTE due to years of head trauma. The Lions still have gotten away with this huge blemish to their already terrible drafting record thanks to the franchise's irrelevance, but hopefully they can turn it around, right? Right?
With the 26th pick in the 2011 NFL Draft, the Kansas City Chiefs select Jonathan Baldwin, wide receiver, Pittsburgh.
Remember the first-round pick the Falcons traded to the Browns for Julio? Jonathan Baldwin ended up being pick number 26 by the Chiefs after a trade by the Browns to move to the 21st spot. The Browns also packaged a 3rd-round pick in this deal, who ended up being Justin Houston, 7-time Pro Bowler and elite pass rusher. And of course, in typical Cleveland fashion, they ended up with a colossal bust in Phil Taylor. Even in the best circumstances where the Browns seemed to stand to benefit, the football gods managed to throw a wrench in their honest efforts. Baldwin was actually the 3rd-ranked wideout in the draft behind Green and Julio, and ended up being one of the least productive pass catchers in the draft despite his first-round billing. Baldwin essentially amounted to the hyped-up training camp star throughout the offseason, but never managed to translate his energy into true production. He totaled only 44 catches, caught 2 touchdowns, and started just 11 games during his 3 years in the league. Kansas City made the mistake of drafting on need in a year where you couldn't go wrong by drafting the best player on the board. Baldwin's career eventually ended in 2013, And the Chiefs quickly learned from their mistakes by drafting a handful of talent in the early rounds of the following 9 seasons and were rewarded with a championship in 2020. When you step back and really examine the shortcomings of Kansas City in the past decade, Baldwin in the first round does seem inconsequential considering the third round selection of Justin Houston. But at the time, and even now, Baldwin is one of the worst first round selections of the 2010s. If there's anything to take away from this video, it's that the draft, in its true form, is unfair. Whether that's an indictment of team management, the differing conditions between college and NFL football, or the nature of the league itself is up for interpretation. But what it simply means is you're often out of luck if you're a fan of one of the few bottom feeders of the league. The 2011 draft gave us stars and stories that will leave a permanent mark on the history of football. But as their time reaches an end, a new door opens for the gifted, admirable, and electrifying stars to dominate in the 2020s and beyond. If you made it this far, thank you, and subscribe for more content.